Hi, my name is Samantha Berger, and this is my master's research study on the impact of underinvestment in education/special education on both students and teachers. So first, we're going to talk about the research context, problem, purpose, and question, then go through the literature review a little bit of methodology, reflexivity statement, positionality statement, the discussion and findings, and lastly, the conclusion. So first, the introduction, research context, problem, purpose, and question. The possibility that an education is the basis of having a productive and meaningful life has always been of interest to me, both on an individual level and in a broader societal way. In particular, it seems to me that a strong educational foundation may only be accessible to some students within public school system, despite schools' dedication to education for all. Many students remain underserved, and therefore inequities within schools and societies persist. Broadly speaking, this research study looks at the impact of public schools not being well enough funded to meet the needs of students with special education needs. The research problem statement. On the topic of how to appropriately include people with different needs within schools and society, research has found that systemic underinvestment in education/special education has a negative impact on both students and teachers. Indeed, the special education needs of students in public schools are currently being met and or not met in various ways, depending on the category of their disability. The challenges of meeting the various special education needs of students is often experienced quite negatively by frontline stakeholders. Research purpose. The purpose of this study was to investigate the specifics of how systemic underinvestment in education/special education has a negative impact on both students and teachers. A link is also made between inequities expressed within school systems and broader societal injustices. Research question. How does systemic underinvestment in education/special education have a negative impact on both students and teachers? So now we're going to go through some key points from the literature review. It is important to note that some of the key developments that have occurred in relation to the funding and delivery of special education services has occurred over the past 50 to 100 years. Historically, for example, children with disabilities were denied admission to many public schools, both in Canada and around the world. Since the 1970s, however, there has been a growing level of international interest in the idea of universal access to a basic education. This worldwide movement has corresponded with the recognition that an inclusive model of education should be deemed to have real value in building a more inclusive society. It has been suggested that in order for the inclusion model to work, education systems need to both mandate and budget for the provision of specific additional supports for special education students within public school classrooms. Unfortunately, the individualized support that should ultimately be available to special education students placed in inclusive classrooms are not necessarily mandated or consistently implemented by regular education teachers and or educational paraprofessionals, nor are they well understood and or supported by school administrators. As a result, the expectation that teachers deliver special education services effectively within the context of systemic underinvestment puts undue strain on teachers, and this impacts students across the special education. This impacts students' access to special education services. In turn, students with disabilities are generally underserved, are at increased risk for both mental health issues in the short term and poverty in the long term. Methodology. The current research study was both small scale and interview-based in nature. The sample consisted of 3 special education teachers, each with significant special education experience. These interviews were qualitative and semi-structured. Since this study was primarily interested in informed teacher perspective, I asked participants questions which were structured accordingly. The anonymity of the participants selected for this study is protected They are referred to as P1, P2, and P3. They have also each signed a consent form which outlines the purposes of the study. The interviews took place by means of video conferencing and were recorded, and then the interviews were transcribed into a written copy for analysis. All demographic and interview-based data was stored on a password-protected computer. There was no known risks for participants' involvement. Reflexivity statement. It is important to note that that as a researcher, I am aware of how my own experience can be situated in relation to my research study topic, and that I can identify why I am pursuing further knowledge and insights on the impact of underinvestments in special education on teachers and students. I am currently enrolled in this Masters of Teaching program as a student with accommodations, and this follows a larger personal history as a student with special education needs since elementary school. It is because of this personal connection to special education that I have become passionate about whether or not all students have adequate access to an appropriate education within public schools. Further, as a person who is also preparing to be a professional educator, it is important to acknowledge that many of my future students will have special education needs that I will want to meet effectively. Therefore, I believe that it is incumbent upon me to have sufficient background knowledge and understand about the impact of existing educational policies and funding formulas on students with special education needs and their teachers. Positionality statement. It has been interesting to note that the majority of the research articles that I accessed for this current study were completed in North America and European countries, as these systems of education are most comparable to what exists in Canada. As it currently stands, most European and Northern American teachers at the primary junior level are middle-class white and female, and although the work of these researchers might represent the demographic of these teachers, they certainly do not represent the diversity of demographics within student populations. This may have led to gaps in the research with regard to the inclusion of more culturally relevant understanding of special education needs. This could be an area worthy of further research. Okay, so now we're going to get into the discussion and the findings, which are broken up into categories. The first category is underinvestment and student placement. The continuum of services model includes inclusion or integration, but it also incorporates segregation. This model is still generally considered to be a fairly legitimate attempt to try to meet the needs of students with a wide range of disabilities and/or special education needs, and is widely used in countries similar to Canada. Findings indicate that the inclusion model is more likely to provide placement for students with learning disabilities, verbal students with autism spectrum disorder, and some students with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder within regular education classrooms. Alternatively, and at the other end of the continuum, the intensive support model is more likely to provide segregated classroom placement to students with mild intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, nonverbal students with ASD, and some students with behavioral exceptionalities and/or psychiatric disabilities. Findings also indicate that the most significant barrier to inclusion has to do with the complexity of students' learning and the attention needs, as well as their overall behavior. Indeed, quite a negative bias exists for students with various behavioral exceptionalities when it comes to both formal classroom placement as well as access to the most appropriate academic supports. In general, this study has found that underinvestment in education/special education significantly impacts the effectiveness of any and all classroom placements for students with special ed needs. The next category is underinvestment and the effectiveness of student placement. It has been found that underinvestment in education/special education disproportionately impacts students with disabilities due to class size and staff to student ratio. It is usually left up to each regular teacher to strike an effective balance between teaching students who don't have IEPs with teaching those students who do. In turn, this impacts the degree to which students have access to the various additional supports they need. Ultimately, underfunding leads to teachers' time, attention, and energy being pulled into too many directions, which in turn affects many students' overall experiences of school. And this is true for students with special education needs in both regular and special ed education settings. Both large class sizes and underfunding of schools disproportionately destabilizes the day-to-day programming for students with special education needs. And in this way, underfunding directly interferes with students' access to required supports. Underfunding also leads to insufficient levels of relevant professional development for various staff who work with students with special education needs, as this important staff training is generally well prioritized or well funded. Generally not well prioritized or well funded. It is said that as long as education/special education remains inadequately funded, public schools will be unable to teach students with special education needs appropriately and/or to do so in an equitable way. The next category is underinvestment and challenges for teachers. The density of the curriculum and expectations to consistently differentiate instruction creates intense pressure for all teachers. Keeping up with the frequent changes in education/special education policy can compound these pressures for regular and special ed teachers alike. Watching students with special education needs struggle to meet their potential, often in ways that can be directly and indirectly linked to budgeting constraints, further leads to increased levels of stress for frontline educators. In general, teachers are left with limited energy to address the needs of particularly challenging students with special education needs. And this too can result in various negative biases and even resentment towards certain students. Underinvestment can also impact teachers' attitudes towards parents and colleagues, and the degree to which regular and special ed teachers are either willing or able to work with other staff effectively. Importantly, when teachers experience the kind of low job satisfaction that accompanies all of these stressors, students' learning is further compromised, and especially so for students with special education needs. Underinvestment and teacher burnout is the next category. Findings show that here is quite a significant relationship between the ongoing stress of not being sufficiently resourced to provide appropriate levels of support to students with special education and the kind of chronic teacher stress that ultimately leads to burnout. At any given time, numerous teachers in every school feel that they will be unable to make it to the end of the school year. Professionals who are chronically spread too thin are less likely to be able to develop creative solutions in relation to meeting the needs of students with special education needs. Unfortunately, there is also a clear relationship between the teacher burnout rate and the quality of special education programming that is available in public schools. Therefore, due to underfunding, students with disabilities can quite frequently lose the very teachers who may be best qualified to help them, but who are nevertheless unable to fulfill their responsibilities to their students when the ongoing strain becomes too much. And the last category is underinvestment and equity. As per the research, as well as the results of the current study, the systemic underinvestment in education/special education has an ongoing negative impact on both students with special education needs, as well as teachers who are charged with meeting these needs effectively. The significance of this is that despite the international trend towards using the kinds of educational theories that support inclusive policies and practices within public schools, the equity issues related to students with disabilities may often be magnified within schools rather than alleviated by others, thus providing access to the regular curriculum and the experiencing thus providing access to the regular curriculum and to experiencing a sense of belonging within classrooms and schools, communities should be the focus of individualized programming for students with special education needs. And this focus must be deliberately mandated, embraced, and funded. The reality is that systemic underfunding of education and special education has resulted in a pervasive devaluing and marginalization of students with disabilities within public schools and their teachers. It would seem that this situation is informed by the various biases that persist within broader society. And in turn, it seems to also inform the replication of such biases. The failure to adequately fund public education / special education leaves both regular teachers and special education at high risk of stress and burnout, and it literally leaves large groups of individual learners behind. As a society, we must consciously invest in the unlearning of unconscious and exclusionary biases about students with special education needs so that all students in schools with a right to an appropriate education have equitable access to the empowering potential of it. Thank you for listening, and that's all I have to say.